So welcome to the University of Nottingham Malaysia Campus Kuala Lumpur Teaching Centre. My name is Shaw Matthews and I'm the Head of School in Modern Languages, Cultures and Sedition. And today's talk is going to get us into more trouble, I'm sure. Can the special branch please identify yourselves? And we'll just pass you the recording afterwards. And I've taught everybody to walk like this for when we leave the building. It's a really important topic and we're very honoured to have the panel that we're able to bring together today. I'm very grateful to Farouk for again allowing Nottingham to partner with the IRF to bring this event to you. I'm grateful to you all for coming here on a Sunday morning for this discussion. That's really all I've got to say. I'm proud and I'm very happy to have this panel, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Zaharom, who's going to moderate today's discussion. Thank you for coming.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. My job is to be the moderator. The word moderate is a very difficult word to use these days, apparently. A dangerous word to use. I think most of you know the distinguished panel we have here, but let me just quickly introduce them, and not in any necessary order. First is Professor James Piscatori from Durham University. He, like most of you will know the stuff that he's done on religion and Islam and international relations. But I think there's one thing that you probably don't know, which I asked him last night whether I could tell you this. He's also perhaps the first Westerner to have interviewed Dr. Mahathir in 1981 when he became Prime Minister. It was supposed to have been a 20-minute interview. In the end, it ended up 2.5 hours. Apparently, the old man just couldn't stop talking. He was a young man then, yes. So that still can't stop talking. James will be speaking for about 30 minutes on the topic, following which the three discussants here, the interveners, will raise questions, perhaps bring in new issues as regards the topic. And they are, I'll begin from the extreme right, is Professor Shad Salim Faruqi, emeritus professor in law, I think one of the top constitutional experts in Malaysia these days, and the voice of reason, one of the voices of reason. So Prof. Shad Salim Faruqi will speak then. Followed by Datuk Nur Farida Arifin, who's had an exceedingly, what's the word for it, exceedingly glorious career. But I think she's more known these days for being one of the 25 eminent Malays who brought up the issue of where we're heading and the problems that we are heading. Some would say 25 eminent Malays, some would say 25 naughty Malays, some troublemaking Malays perhaps. Yeah. Whatever it is, I'm glad to see her here today. And finally, we have Dr. Farouk Musa, who's a new friend, but it's a new friend for the university, a new friend of mine, and I'm glad he's also here today, and he's one of the main organizers of the talk today. So without wasting more time, let me invite Professor James Piscatori over to begin his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman. Thank you, Farouk and Sean, for the invitation to speak again here. I don't take any credit or blame for the Dr. Mahathir interview. So thank you for pointing that out. I'm happy today to talk about this larger issue of Islam and human rights. And Farouk has, in his usual mischievous way, has set the question as unanswerable. And it is one which is extremely difficult to talk about. I'm sure that you have local concerns that you would like to bring to this discussion. I'm going to try to stay off most of those. And I'm sure the members of the panel will, however, be braver than I am and will wade right in. What I'd like to talk about is this relationship between the Islamic conception of human rights and the universal conception of human rights. You'll see that one of the points that I'm trying to develop here is that the universal, well, actually, how do I, would you mind using this? No, and how do I move? Okay, there we go. Is this on? Yep. Yep, okay, thanks. So one of the points that I'm trying to develop is the relationship between the universal and the Islamic, or the universal in particular. And of course, one of the themes that I'll try to develop is that we have to ask how universal is the universal? So right away, we're faced with this sort of almost conventional wisdom on the subject of Islam and human rights, that basically they're incompatible, that there are contradictory accounts. We think of the human rights regime as secular, we think of it as liberal, and we can see that, of course, there have been very significant Islamic objections to that account. I give you the words of one cleric, and it won't surprise you, of course, that it's a Saudi cleric, who says it quite clearly. How could those who are doomed to roast in hell be given the same rights and prerogatives as those who are marked for eternal life in paradise? So we have no ambiguity there in terms of trying to make a stark opposition to what is thought to be this universal regime. What I'd like to note, though, is that there is actually a considerable debate within Muslim circles on this question. And for the sake of convenience, I've sort of organized them into three schools of thought. There, of course, could be others, but roughly speaking, there's a conservative tendency, a modernist one, and a kind of a radical one. The conservative one is more or less what I've just said, but in particular, it is based on the objections that Muslim states gave to the formation of the covenants, or the documents in international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then the subsequent documents, the covenants on political and then on social rights as well, where basically they objected to a number of provisions, but essentially two. And these, of course, are sticking points. The right to change religion, and this, of course, relates to the larger debate about apostasy in Islam, and, of course, secondly, women's rights. And in particular, the objection, and you can actually, I've actually gone through these, and you can go through the documents about this. They're all preserved, about what the Saudis said, what the Pakistanis said, what everybody said, the Lebanese, etc., on these rights and these documents. And they, of course, specifically objected to the idea that that women should be of full age as a marital right. So there are a number of specific versions of this, but there's one of them that are in these documents and to which they object. So that's the conservative tendency. There's also a modernist tendency, and some people argue, and there's a very famous statement by Sir Hamilton Gibb, one of the great writers on Islam at Oxford and Harvard, in which he said, really, modernism is just a form of apologetics. So you can take it as you want, but basically the argument here is that there is no incompatibility, that Islam contains the rights that are found in the documents that are international law, and that in fact in many ways it preceded the Western encapsulation of those documents, that we can find them there. So for example, they'll say, well, equality, maybe not exactly equality, but there is this idea that the Quran clearly says that there are no differences except in this is the taqwa idea, the idea of piety. There are no differences except in piety. That rulers must be accountable to the Shari'a, therefore there's some form of limitation of constitutionalism. social welfare is provided. So this argument would say, whatever you think are the important human rights, we've got them. And not only have we got them, but we had them before the West sort of decided that they were important. And then there's a third school of thought, which you can imagine is a minority one, and quite controversial, but a very forceful, very powerful argument. And this says that, in fact, we have to call a spade a spade. The Sharia does have some things which are incompatible with the covenants of human rights, and that really we're just going to have to change them. And if that means an abrogation of Sharia provisions, then we do it. So it's quite controversial, and what do they point to? The equality of women argument, the treatment of non-Muslims, and also the question of slavery. Now, when these people were writing, the question of slavery was an historical one. It, of course, is no longer. It is because of ISIS and the Islamic State, which has very directly, very clearly legitimized the idea of slavery again. Then this question has come back to the fore. So we have really powerful sort of arguments here, various schools of thought, and the issues don't go away. So I guess the question I want to ask is, are they reconcilable, these two forms of human rights? And again, there's an optimistic scenario and there's a pessimistic scenario. The optimistic scenario would sort of argue that states will adapt to the universal order, in large part because they want to gain legitimacy. They don't want to look as if they are opposed to the international order. And so they'll do that. And in so doing, over time, this will induce a kind of culture change. It will kind of induce socialization. That quote is from the Nobel Institute, the people who give the awards, that there is a common language of human rights, and that the common language of human rights will prevail, and that people will adapt to it over time. Now that, of course, is juxtaposed with the pessimistic scenario, which is quite strong. The argument that, particularly with the advent of Islamism and Islamist groups and parties, we have a hardening of Islam. And this quote from one particular sort of observer said, before a tidal wave of passion, the fragile world held up by a liberal order crumbled. And that this onslaught of Islamism has led to the kind of retreat from these liberal ideas, etc. So we have a kind of a very clearly delineated, demarcated debate on this issue. Now, further to this, Muslim states, and I guess states, and I'd be interested to hear the panel's viewpoint about who is determining human rights. Are they states, are they peoples, are they non-state groups? But the organization of the Islamic Conference, which of course is an interstate organization, has always argued that the Universal Declaration, the covenants on civil and political rights, are so biased. So we need our own. And they formulated the Cairo Declaration in 1990. And it's a fascinating document. And in many ways, I think it would be, it's interesting to look at because they say things like, discrimination on the basis of race, color, language, etc., including religion, is forbidden, is prohibited. And so there's a reaffirmation of kind of broad ideas. But even the beginning, when they say, they use the words quite clearly, that there is an equality of basic human dignity, but do not use the words human rights. And so is this equivalent? And that's another question. It is quite clear that though they argue for such things as, arbitrary arrest is forbidden, that there should be rights for women, and they're put, by the way, in terms of women's have rights to marriage. Do they have rights in marriage is another question, on which it is silent. And the really difficult article is Article 24, which essentially, after you get through all the Articles 1 to 23, which essentially make the argument that Islam stands for good things, we then get to Article 24, which say all the rights and freedoms stipulated in this declaration are subject to the Shari'a. And this, of course, have they given with one hand and taken away with the other? That's the argument. You should note that, and you would know the proper name, the International Commission of Jurists unanimously rejected this as an unacceptable statement of human rights. So we have it's quite a controversial document. So it brings us to a kind of a philosophical debate about cultural relativism. And I guess the basic question there is, should Muslim exceptionalism, because this is essentially what they're arguing, that there is something exceptional to the Muslim world, should this be accepted, or should it be deplored and overcome in some way? And so in a way, I call it the liberal dilemma. The liberal dilemma is, should you respect difference? Should you respect the fact that the Islamic world has different views of human rights, and that that's the true liberal position, tolerance of difference? Or is the true liberal position that, in fact, there is a greater good, a greater common cause that must be served, and therefore we mustn't concede to a cultural relativism? So there's kind of a debate here, and I think it's not a simple argument as to what should be the proper liberal position. On one hand, Muslims argue that the views on women and minorities are just simply different, that it comes from the Word of God, that the Sharia norms are different, and that they're supreme. And that if you're really liberal, then you would accept that. You would accept that that you should tolerate that there is differences. And interestingly, many would argue, invoking the discourse of rights, there is a human right to have different religious views. So it's a powerful argument. On the other hand, culturally defined norms can be seen as at variance with the universal norms, the supposed universal norms. This argument would say there are no Islamic rights, there are no religious rights, there are human rights. And that's what matters. And there cannot be tolerance of what is wrong. We just have to sort of do what is necessary here. So let's look at, for a moment, at and I'm largely going to argue that what these differences are, to a certain extent, are constructed. So we have affirmed differences between the supposed universal regime and the Islamic views of it. So universal regime, rights derived from the very nature of man, the French, the rights of man idea. It's inherent in human nature. The Islamic view, or at least the standard, the conventional view as articulated by the Cairo Declaration, is that rights are a grant from divine will. So it's not inherent in the nature of humanity. Rights are absolutely applicable. There's no place for relativism. Freedom without restraint is essentially the universal idea. The conventional Islamic one, the primacy of Sharia norms have to be accepted. There should be freedom, but freedom in conformity with a moral order. And the moral order, of course, defined by the Sharia. Universal rights-based regime predicated on equality. The Islamic regime predicated on differences. Differences between the believer and the non-believer, differences, of course, according to gender. All religions valid in the universal idea. Islam has the absolute truth. And by the way, the preamble to the Cairo Declaration clearly says that. It clearly says that Islam has the ultimate truth, and that is what guides this view of Islam. So now my argument gets a little bit more complex. I'm trying to argue here. We have fairly clearly defined views. We have a received wisdom on this subject, and I've tried to delineate the schools of thought on the subject. Now, the assumption is often in this discussion that it's kind of written in stone, that there's no possibility of change here, that the stock alternatives are kind of built in. And I think we have to say two things about that. First, and again, I'd be really interested to hear what the panel has to say about this, the universal regime has been qualified to some extent. And I'll say a little bit more about that. It has been qualified to some extent. And so many people are increasingly questioning this idea whether or not there really is a universal regime. Should this be questioned? And then the second point I want to argue is that when we talk about the Islamic narrative, I want to make it clear that it's one version of Islam. Many of you will know fiqh is, the jurisprudence. And I'll try to develop that this is a particular version of Islam, that there can be an alternative transcript, an alternative version of it. So take the first point about is the universal regime has been qualified to some extent. I think a lot of it, and I don't want to put it entirely on this, but a lot of it has to do with the freedom of expression debate. So we come down in the particular form of, is freedom of expression unlimited? Is it absolute? And of course the question of the cartoons of the Prophet, Charlie Hebdo in Paris, the Danish cartoons, you know all of these. This has stimulated a great debate. And so one view, in which we often hear in the media, etc., and particularly in the West, is that this particular human right, the freedom of speech, is absolute. That there's no question that there's no way, not possible to kind of abridge it. Of course, the other view is that it is limited, and here the probably the most famous proponent is not from the Muslim world, but it's the Pope, who recently said, very famously said, that in fact this religious rights can trump human rights. That we have to be really careful here, and that you can't trample on religious sensitivities and religious sensibilities, etc. So we've got a very powerful and advocate of that kind of view. And I'd also like to point out that there have been lots of debates within the UN, particularly between 1999 and 2011, over a new concept which some argue is being crystallized. And I'd be interested to hear what you say. Some people say it's sort of being crystallized into a kind of international legal norm, and that is defamation of religion. That there is freedom of expression, but you can't defame religion. Now, whether that is actually accepted as a human right is not quite clear yet, but the point is that something's emerging, and therefore human rights law can restrict the freedom of expression in the interests of a larger public morality. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that human rights regime, this idea that they're absolute and universal and unchangeable, is under question. It's evolving to some extent. I don't want to overstate it, but a little bit of it is occurring. And so we have to ask, at the end of the day, what is this universal regime that we are measured against? What is it? Okay, even if the universal regime is qualified, we come to my second point, which really has to do with so what when it's related to Islam and religious rights. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't mean that religious rights should take precedence over universal rights. No, it doesn't mean that. And it doesn't mean that religious rights are universally agreed. That there can be different versions of the religious rights. So, sort of headline thought, religious rights can be contested. And again, it's not exactly the way it's being argued. So I'm sure you will appreciate that in the elephant in the room is the hudud debate. So we have here the, is hudud something which is necessarily to be applied as of right? So it seems to me that the Islamic position is a constructed one at the end of the day. And it's got three indisputable parts to it, or built into it. The first is the conventional Islamic jurisprudence, and that's everything that I just told you about. You know, not human nature, divine will. Not equality, but the idea that there should be differences between believers and gender, etc. That conventional Islamic view has indeed been articulated. It's definitely there. It's definitely important and serves, for many people, this is the definition of what Islam is. So I grant that it's there. We must also say that there's a political side to it. We must also say that political authorities are using this conventional jurisprudence to bolster their own power. So, putting it simply, a lot of the debates over the Shari'a are really political debates about solidifying power. And then my final big point here is that there are different interpretations of the Islamic position, and something which is sometimes not accepted, that this is what everyone thinks it is, but there might be other sort of views of it too. Although, admittedly, as I've tried to argue, what I'm going to say now is what some people say, what I say. It may not be what the dominant view is, and certainly not the dominant view of the religious establishment. But just for the sake of argument, show the diversity and the richness of the Islamic tradition, I think we have to say certain things. That jurisprudence has been historically contingent. So the interpretations that we have in Islamic jurisprudence are because of the conditions of the 7th century, the 8th century, the 9th century, when Islamic law was emerging. And so clearly that should almost automatically be questioned as to whether it's relevant today. So I think an alternative way of looking at this can take into account kind of three things. One is that there are radically different circumstances. Another is that you invoke textual support, but there are always other textual references that you can use. And so, you know, this very famous one about the treatment of the non-Muslims, the dhimma idea, clearly one could argue that it does have a Quranic base to it. I mean, I choose this because this is one that it does have a Quranic reference point as opposed to a kind of vague Islamic background. So if you look at Surah 9, verse 29, there is a discussion about the treatment of the non-believers and the payment of a special tax, etc. But that, of course, was contingent upon the circumstances of early Islam. And you certainly have other versions of the Quran, which, an example, the famous in Surah Baqarah, you have, of course, that there is no compulsion in religion. So which do you privilege? It's possible to go in various ways, but we need to recognize that at least that there are other transcripts, other versions of doing it. And then finally, the invocation of reason. Many of you will know this is the whole debate about ijtihad. In a way, this can be a technical debate, so I'm not going to go into all of that. What's really important is to note that Islam has always had a rationalist tradition. And the Mutazilite tradition, which is this rationalist one, is well embedded in Islamic philosophy. Well embedded, and many, the recovering of the idea that reason is not inconsistent with a divinely ordained order is something which is being argued by many people and would help to give us a different perspective on human rights. So I think something profound has happened in the debate over human rights, and in a way, to put a prescription on it, tragic. One, there's been a move from principle to positive law. What is meant to be guidance becomes a commandment. And in other words, a kind of legalistic Islam emerges. And so the creation of a kind of a positivist version of Islam, to my mind, is distorting. And the second is that those who argue this think of it really as an Islamic duty, and that is its force for them. It's an Islamic duty, but they argue that it's a right which can be asserted against others. So what is really an articulation of we are obliged to do this or that becomes it is our right to do so, and you must defer to that because it is our right to do it. So I think there's a kind of translation here that's going on as a result of various developments, and that I think is not necessarily useful. So final word, seems to be there are two challenges in this whole issue. The first is kind of from above, and the other is from below. So what's the challenge from above? This is when groups and others proclaim themselves to be the guardians of Islam and impose it. Some of you will have heard me on the Islamic State, so I'm not going to go on all that about that again. But by and large, the short version is that I do not personally believe that although Islam has prescriptions which are important in the social and political realm, it does not prescribe a state. And the mistake of the modern period is to argue that there is such a thing as an Islamic state. And this kind of imposition from above is not only distorting of Islam, but of course it also is harmful for human rights. And the bottom-up approach is that there's an undermining from below. And here, and I think you can see the relevance to the local debates. At the end of the day, no matter what you say about the Shari'a, no matter what you say, whether it is or is not applicable, it is this or that, it has resonance. And the society, or segments of the society out there, think that it's necessary to have. And so it becomes a matter of kind of societal understandings of Shari'a. And this is the long term. This is the kind of almost having to adapt people's attitudes towards it. So I guess to summarize my argument, universal rights may not be as universal as they had been originally thought. There are cultural and religious differences, there are. But we need to recognize those differences are particularistic and self-serving. And in any case, these particularistic versions cannot be imposed on societies where there is no consent to them. So thank you very much.